The three-day G7 summit kicked off in Canada on Sunday. Besides 7 top developed economies present at the summit, leaders from other nations, including Ukrainian President Volodomyr Zelenskyy, will attend as well. Now, joining me to discuss the elephant in the room for this year's summit is Iain Begg, professor and economist at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Hello, Professor, and thank you very much for joining us on World News Tonight.
Good evening to you.
Good evening. Now, we have 3 wars, 2 hot ones in Ukraine and the Middle East, and a global trade war that is constantly brewing. What do you think is the single most important issue at this year's G7?
Well, I think what would have happened is that Canada would have had a very nice agenda, and it would have been thrown out the window because of what's going on in Iran, with the flights from the bombing coming from Israel and the retaliation by the Iranians. So that will have derailed all the pre-planned discussion. That said, I'm sure they will try to look at the wars. They'll be trying as well to think about the economic prospects for the global economy. There'll be a caution around what to say around and to Donald Trump, given his prickliness on some matters that pertain to the economy. And there will also be attempts to open doors to other parts of the world. You mentioned Zelenskyy being invited as a guest, but there are other guests, including the Indian Prime Minister and the South African President.
Yes. Now, in terms of trade, when we look at this trade war that is brewing, and of course we don't know exactly where it's taking us here in the European Union, the EU seems ready to accept 10% tariffs on European goods and will reduce import duties on U.S. manufactured autos and might remove some other barriers to cars imported from the United States. Do you think that this indeed will satisfy Washington, and how might this affect U.S.-EU trade?
It might satisfy Washington, but I very much doubt it will be the final word from the White House, which has a dynamic of its own in relation to these negotiations. It's very hard to tell from today until tomorrow what the White House is going to say is the next step. It's not so long ago since we heard that he was proposing to increase to 50% the tariffs on Europe. So we just don't know what's going to happen next with such an unpredictable president.
Well, Trump placed the self-imposed deadline of July 9th to make a deal with the United States, or he will slap 50% tariffs on EU goods. So if there is no deal in place, what would this do for the EU economy and for bilateral trade?
Well, what it will certainly do is freeze the trade. Tariffs at the level of 50% are not quite, but nearly a complete blockage on exporting to that country, because if you increase your price by 50%, because of the cost of the tariffs, you're not going to sell very much. So it's something that everybody would hope would be diminished when any sort of deal is done. But the other direction, which is something that I understand the Canadians were trying very hard to push, was to say, right, we have the Americans going in one particular direction. What about the G6? That's the rest of us, with some of our guests, like the Indians, thinking in terms of operating outside the format of the G7 and trying to construct a new trading arrangement, which may well include China, for the rest of the world.
Right. And actually, when we look at Canada, it's quite interesting to see Canada is trying to build pipelines to its shores so that it can export oil to other markets. It's wholly reliant on the United States to buy its oil, and it subsidizes its oil to that extent. Now, I'm wondering here in Europe if like you mentioned, if indeed the 50% tariffs basically blocks all trade, could Europe perhaps look to another big player and maybe even look to China to fill this gap?
Well, you won't fill the gap, not least because China is a very successful exporter, and the trade balance between Europe and China is not very much in Europe's favor. China is a difficult market to crack. It has its own restrictions on imports. So the idea that you can substitute other parts of the world, especially very quickly, for what might well be lost with the US is far-fetched. I think it'll be a slow process, and it may well be that Europe is going to have to go through some form of painful adjustment, which could involve tipping into recession if the threats coming from the White House materialize. The trouble, as always, is we just don't know what the end game from Trump is going to be and whether the tariffs that are eventually imposed will be anything like the severe levels we're talking about. They've already been downplayed in the outline negotiation with China from well over 100% to much more reasonable levels, which permit trade still to go on.
The UK had the largest trade contraction in 2 years. What was that, in April of this year? What do you think is still needed in this US-UK trade agreement?
Well, there are big areas which are outside the trade agreement, particularly the automobile exports, where the UK has been relatively successful. But the UK is also a net exporter of services, as indeed is the US. And for the UK's economy to do very well, it would hope to do far more on exporting financial, business and other services, which in many ways outshine some of the manufacturing sectors, which have been the UK's main exports in the past.
The World Bank says that in the next 5 years, it will be the worst economic times, or in economic terms, since the 1960s. If that's true, what can we expect in terms of performance? And if GDP goes down, will Europe be able to afford this vast spending, this 5% on its military?
Well, 5% on the military can be afforded if you choose to cut other forms of expenditure. And the main pressure will come on the welfare state budgets, which, as we all know, are very high in the European Union, indeed across Europe. But that never comes easily. If you try to remove the benefits that people obtain from the welfare state, they're going to object. So you can see a lot of friction in the pipeline if this shift towards military expenditure is at the expense of normal welfare budgets. It can be done, it just will be painful. But I think we should not get ahead of ourselves here. We haven't yet seen the imposition of tariffs on the scale that Trump has threatened. And my guess, and that's the best you can do with Trump, his guess, is that it will not materialize in the form that he's proposed.
The U.S. and Japan are said to be on the cusp of making a deal. Do you think that this could serve as a model for other countries doing negotiations with the United States?
Well, there are deals in progress and deals not concluded all over the place, because Trump is trying to reorganize trade with every single trading partner. As you mentioned earlier, the UK has an outline deal. China has an outline deal. Therefore, it's not clear that what Japan manages to obtain will be any different from those kinds of deals, except in one respect. Both China and Japan have for a long time run trade surpluses vis-a-vis the United States, and that has been one of the motivations for Trump to try to correct it by using the very blunt instrument of tariffs. That's not been the case for the UK, which has been more or less in trade balance with the US.
Well, which brings us back to the G7. To what extent do you think this year's G7 will be a series of bilateral meetings between leaders and Donald Trump, as opposed to a traditional G7 summit?
Well, these bilateral meetings go on all the time in the background. You have to think back to 2018 when there was a ganging up on Trump led by Angela Merkel. There's a famous picture of her standing up, berating him while he's sitting down looking rather shocked, and various other leaders looking on. There'll be all kinds of discussions going on. I'm sure Trump will say, what is the European Union doing here being represented, because he doesn't like the European Union leadership. He may get on better with Friedrich Merz than he did with his German predecessors. So that's the basis for the newcomers to try to do deals. He gets on very well with Giorgia Meloni, so she will have an influence in both the Italian-American bilateral deals, but also in trying to make the case for the European Union. There'll be all sorts going in. And at the same time, leaders like Mark Carney in Canada will be trying to do bilateral discussions with the Brits, with the French, with the Germans, and maybe even with the European Union leaders to say, how do we navigate this very difficult threat to all of us?
Now, do you think, speaking of the EU, Trump has talked about the value-added tax wanting the European Union to somehow do away with this because he says it makes American products less competitive in Europe. But the European Union said, or the European Commission has said that they are not interested in doing this. Is there another mechanism that could alleviate American concerns or increase imports from the United States without doing away with the value-added tax?
Right, here I'm just going to be blunt, because what it shows is Trump's economic illiteracy. The value-added tax is imposed equally for anybody selling within the EU market, including exporters like the US, but including internal shifts, internal movements, for example, from Poland to Germany or even within Poland. So there are value-added taxes is a very reasonable way of trying to impose a sales tax. The Americans have sales taxes, but they tend to be imposed at the state or locality level. If you go to New York, you'll find that you have a hotel bill of, say, it's expensive there, $500. Then you get to local sales tax, state sales tax, and then you're expected to add a tip. So your $500 very rapidly becomes $700. It's a sales tax. Tariffs are sales tax. So they're all different ways of doing similar things, which is extracting money from consumers in their capacity as taxpayers.
Indeed. Now, talking about the price oil caps on Russian oil, if you could just very briefly, any expectations from this G7 meeting that they will agree with the United States to lower the price caps?
Well, I think there's a good chance that will happen, but we have to look as well at what's going on in the Middle East. Already as a result of the Israel-Iran conflict, you've seen a spike in the price of oil. If Iran were to react by closing the Straits of Hormuz, preventing exports from major exporters in the Gulf, that could see a further spike in oil prices. So it's very much up in the air what's going to happen to oil prices. And if you were to try to predict oil prices, you'd probably be on a losing streak.
Probably. Professor Iain Begg, of course, from the London School of Economics, economist. Thank you, sir, very much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Good night.